Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
The rights of British citizens have their roots in the great dynastic struggles in the Middle Ages. Tired of King John's tyranny, the English barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, which was the first attempt to limit the arbitrary power of kings. Another settlement came in the 16th century with the rejection of the absolute power of the Pope during the Reformation, an event that did so much to shape our nation. The third great settlement was wrought from the civil wars that pitted Crown against Parliament in the 1640s. Once again, the English railed against the tyrannical power of a monarch who believed that he was above the law. The struggle to hold absolute power to account was finally resolved in 1689 when Parliament staged a coup, ousting James II in favour of William of Orange. But before he took the throne, William was required to sign the British Bill of Rights, guaranteeing parliamentary power and privileges. And it's this document, an agreement between the Crown and Parliament, gave birth to the constitutional monarchy that still underpins the British state. What is significant about these great settlements is that they all occurred before the modern notion of freedom had been broadly established. Before Thomas Paine asserted that freedom was vested in individual liberty, the British found their freedom through the struggle to hold those in power to account. After the failure of the Chartist movement to gain the vote for working men, the focus shifted into the workplace, and campaigns for better pay and shorter hours were eventually fruitful, and in 1900 the unions formed their own political party to represent the cause of labour, and this party finally came to power in 1945. In the years that followed, policies aimed at creating a fairer society saw the percentage of wealth received by the richest 1% fall year on year from 13% to 6% in the mid-70s. This trend was reversed in 1979 with the election of Margaret Thatcher, and the percentage of wealth received by the top percent has since climbed to levels not seen in this country since the First World War. And here's a graph that shows that decline and then rise of the percentage of wealth received by the richest 1%. Now, I'm sure some of you may see the immediate implications of this graph, that the Thatcherites were a bunch of venal tyrants who tore our country apart, and it all went wrong in 1979. And that may well be true, but only up until 1997. When the Tories were thrown out of power. And as you'll notice, the graph doesn't change in 1997. It keeps on climbing. There is no turnaround when New Labour come to power. Why did this happen? Well, during the post-war period, while workers extended their rights, the economic liberalism that predominated before universal suffrage underwent a transformation. Advances in technology, especially air travel, had made possible a globalised market in goods and skills, despite the fact that the global economy was still based on a national model that allowed governments to efficiently levy taxes and labour to successfully organise. Now, in response to this tension between markets and nation-states, an economic neoliberalism emerged that recognised no legitimacy other than that of the free market. Margaret Thatcher introduced this doctrine into our society in the 1980s, and as you can see from this graph, Tony Blair remained true to its basic principles. The neoliberal project takes the form of a rejection of any form of public control or accountability. Whatever the economic problem, deregulation and privatisation are pushed as the answer. And if this doesn't deliver prosperity, well, its supporters claim that's because the market is not free enough and push for even greater deregulation. Neoliberalism not only holds up the free market as the best means to run an economy, it also offers capitalism a means by which to escape from any responsibility for outcomes. As such, it's a form of fundamentalism, almost religious in its form. It's a classic con trick, the invisible hand, in which those benefiting from the markets can claim that any damage done to national economies or the social fabric as a result of their decisions are in fact nothing to do with them at all, but simply a function of the market. And in the face of such blind fundamentalism, anyone seeking to create different outcomes by regulation or by capping excessive remuneration is scolded for being unrealistic. All legitimacy comes from the market. However, this graph suggests otherwise. Clearly, it is possible to create in a free market conditions that close the gap between the richest and the poorest. How is that done? How is it possible to do that? Well, here's another graph that shows the membership of trade unions over the same period. The blue line is the membership of trade unions. Do you see any correlation there? The power of the unions to hold capitalism to account mirrors the decline in the ability of the top 1% to hang on to their profits. This suggests that something can be done. This graph suggests that a citizen's ability to hold capital to account in the workplace, in the markets, in civil society is key to making the economy work for everyone, not just those at the top. And it will take, to do that, it will take nothing less than the creation of a new political settlement on a par with those of 1948 and 1689. This will involve, obviously, strengthening both workers' representation at a corporate level and probably the nationalisation of some utilities and other crucial infrastructure. But if it's just about the economy, it doesn't go far enough. In order to engage everyone, important changes really need to occur outside of the workplace, within society. The task before us is not merely to create a sustainable economy that doesn't lurch from bust to boom, but to address the glaring imbalance that has arisen between London and the rest of the country. Now, devolution has already given the Scots the wherewithal to challenge the neoliberal orthodoxy that Westminster promotes. And with similar powers devolved to Wales and Northern Ireland, they too could start to create a different social economy. England, however, has yet to enjoy the benefits of devolution. And part of the reason for that is that we do not have a border between ourselves and the Westminster Parliament. And as a result of that, the kind of civic nationalism that's taken root in Wales and in Scotland hasn't been able to find any purchase. In order to shift the balance of power away from the southeast of England, we need something other than devolution in England. We need decentralisation, offering the same powers that the Scottish Parliament has to the regions of England. I believe that we must begin that by making the most unaccountable people accountable. And the most unaccountable people in the British Constitution are in the very heart of Westminster, in the Houses of Parliament, where for 800 years, unaccountable men and women have sat in judgment on our laws and customs. The House of Lords is, I believe, the place to start the long process of rebalancing the accountability question in the UK. Now, before you all say, oh, you know, Lords reform's not an issue with the electorate, take a look at the manifestos of the three main political parties from the last election. Labour, Liberal Democrats, even the Tories felt the need to include a clear commitment to introduce an elected second chamber if elected. Because the truth about the Lords is that there are very few people who are satisfied with the status quo apart from their lordships themselves. Members of Parliament voted in favour of an elected second chamber as recently as 2007, and in polling last year, the public were 69% in favour of election. And it's not as if we can afford to do nothing. In an attempt at do-it-yourself reform, recent Prime Ministers have sought to attain a broad political balance within the upper house following each general election by appointing enough peers to try and reflect the strength of the House of Commons. The problem with that is peers can't be removed, which means that instead of starting from scratch, the only way to do that is to beef up the numbers if you're really going to create a genuine balance. So, if, as expected, at the next election the Liberal Democrat vote collapses, the need to balance the House, the second chamber, the Lords, around a base number of already sitting Liberal Democrat peers could potentially send membership of the House of Lords over the 1,000 mark. It's already up around 800. Now, much is made about how appointment to the House of Lords creates a broader pool of talent than that in the Commons, but in terms of representation, it's simply not the case. 45% of peers are from London and the South East. 64% are from south of the Severn Humber line. 95% are white, 78% are male, 82% are over 60. And despite the good work that members of the upper house do, the opaque nature of appointment continues to undermine the legitimacy of Parliament. And that's going to be the elephant in the room at the next election. Although obviously the debate is going to be dominated by the economy, politicians will be wondering if the disconnect between voters and the electorate will again lead to no single party being given a mandate to govern. Now, obviously scandals in Westminster have played a part in that process, that strange result that wasn't really a result that we got at the last election. But away from the headlines, politics is in danger of becoming a spectator sport for many citizens, because 59% of parliamentary constituencies are now regarded as safe seats. And in those seats, when the election is called, voters know already who's going to win. And in a long-term one-party constituency, the incentive to join a political party that's not the one that wins is very, very low. And even when people do make the effort, the majority could be wondering if it was worth voting at all. At the last election, an unprecedented 52.8% of votes were cast for losing candidates. And representative democracy, at its heart, has to be about people voting. But if the electorate come to believe that their votes don't really achieve anything, then we may find that our democracy is in decline. I believe that reform of the House of Lords, if done correctly, could address this issue by giving greater meaning to every vote in the cast in the general election. And this issue has been on the agenda since Labour's partial reform in 1999, when all but 92 hereditary peers were removed from the legislature. But since then, the stumbling block for reformists has been the need to maintain the primacy of the House of Commons. The two-chamber or bicameral system of Parliament that exists in Britain works on the principle that one house has more legitimacy than the other. Whilst both houses can initiate legislation, our second chamber, the House of Lords, must eventually accept the will of the primary chamber, the House of Commons. And this process relies on the fact that MPs are directly elected by their constituents, giving them greater legitimacy than the appointed members of the House of Lords. No one who hopes to bring democracy to the upper chamber can ignore the need to preserve the primacy of the Commons, not least because it's members of the Commons themselves who will ultimately make the decision on whether or not to implement reform. The challenge then for reformers is to come up with a form of election that expresses the will of the people in the House of Lords, but does not confer the same mandate, the same legitimacy, the same power as that enjoyed by MPs. Now, my response to that conundrum is to suggest a form of indirect election for the second chamber. Now, indirect election is a common method of maintaining the balance of power in a bicameral system. Both France and Germany use indirect election to maintain the primacy of their lower house. In France, they do this by the upper house is put together by an electoral college of local elected representatives. So it has input from the voters one step removed. And in Germany, parties in the state governments appoint members to the upper house. Now, the method of indirect election I'm proposing is a new idea that has not yet been put to use. The secondary mandate system is a form of indirect election that distributes seats in the second chamber in proportion to the votes cast in the general election. Now, under the current electoral system, I'm sure you'll be aware, if you vote for a losing candidate, your vote goes in the bin, and that's done with. At the last election, for the first time, 52.8% of votes went into the bin. The secondary mandate system utilises all of the votes cast to produce an upper chamber that reflects the will of the people. This method will result in representation at Westminster for 90% of votes cast. How does it work? This is the science. Prior to the election, each party would compile a list of candidates for each of the 12 regions and nations of the UK. Once the polls are closed, all of the votes cast in each region will be tallied and the candidates elected according to the percentage of votes cast for their party, reading from the top of the list. Each region would return a maximum of 25 successful candidates, creating a house of around 300. Now, the aim of the secondary mandate is to protect the primacy of the Commons while at the same time giving greater legitimacy to the second chamber. However, it does have other advantages, the most notable of which is that it encourages participation in the general election by adding value to everyone's vote. I don't believe that people will get off their arses and go out and vote for people who are only going to scrutinise legislation. I believe an elected chamber will have a turnout similar to the European elections, to council elections, heaven forbid, to the elections for police commissioners. So it encourages people to go out and cast their vote in the general election in the knowledge that there's a very, very strong 90% to 95% chance that they will get representation for their party at Westminster. Another advantage is that it gives a voice to the regions at a time when London and the South East dominate both the national debate and the economy. If each of the regions sends 25 members to Westminster, it should be possible by finding things that we have in common in the Southwest with people in the Northwest and the Northeast and elsewhere around the country to start that process of rebalancing, of decentralisation that I believe is crucial to greater accountability. Over the past 30 years, civil society has been battered and bruised by a sharp-elbowed neoliberalism that has cut corners in the pursuit of profits and swept away time-worn custom in the name of progress. It has sought to give the impression of inevitability, that the free market alone is capable of delivering the best outcome for everyone. Central to this revolution has been the market's resistance to any form of accountability. Yet, the events of the past 5 years have put into question the functioning of markets, their purpose, and the outcomes that they have delivered. In order to increase profits, neoliberalism has needed to undermine security among the workforce, leaving people feeling they have no control over their lives anymore. This sense of powerlessness has in turn given rise to a cynicism that looks for scapegoats among the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. Wherever we look, in Fleet Street, in Grangemouth, in the tax-dodging corporations that line our high streets, we face the absolute power of a market that believes it is above the law. I believe that we need to push back against that power, just as our ancestors did against kings and popes, until we reach a new settlement with capitalism. And I believe that the first step towards that goal can be taken by reforming the Lords in a manner that reboots our democracy and kickstarts a revolution in society, not least because it can be done at the next election or the one after that. It can be plumbed in. You know, for too long, we have allowed the corporations to game the system in this country and elsewhere. I believe the time has come to renew our traditional commitment to accountability by taking on the absolute power of the markets, by redefining socialism as a means by which we hold capitalism to account. Our slogan is already out there. It's in the plazas of Spain. It's in the mouths of Los Indignados. Their cry is, Democracia Real Ya, real democracy now.